Hello and welcome. This is the history of medieval philosophy, and I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video, we'll be discussing the early medieval philosophy of an important Islamic philosopher, al-Farabi. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. I'm not going to be discussing every bit of his philosophy because as you read it, you'll quickly discover that it's quite complex. In that one of the things that al-Farabi likes to do is really lay out lots and lots of distinctions. So I'm not going to cover every intricate moment of his arguments. But what I do hope to do in this video is provide you a sort of general overview of his philosophy, and then we'll also take a look at one of his texts in some particularity so you can see how, in many ways, al-Farabi really is sort of the second Aristotle. And in fact, he was known, or he would be later referred to as the second teacher. The first teacher is Aristotle, and in many ways, his commentaries were absolutely essential. He's not the most well-known of the Islamic philosophers, but he's definitely an important one, a very, very important philosopher. He commented on many of Aristotle's works. He actually also wrote expositions on Plato. He was praised later for his work on logic and political theory, and really he contributed to both Muslim and Jewish thought. In fact, Maimonides, who is a thinker we'll be looking at later here, Maimonides held al-Farabi in very high esteem. Now, he was actually known in the Christian world, but to a lesser extent compared to Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushdi. So, what about his philosophical perspective? I think the key thing that will be helpful to know is that for al-Farabi, there's an essential unity between Plato and Aristotle's thinking. We have a tendency today when we teach or when we talk about Plato and Aristotle to really think of them as almost opposing figures. You'll recall in the famous Raphael painting, Aristotle's pointing towards the earth and Plato's pointing towards the heavens, and this seems to symbolize a sort of divergence of views, and that's true to some extent. But essentially, in many ways, there is a unity, and in fact, there's later contemporary commentators on Aristotle. For instance, John Wilde makes a very, very strong case for the relationship between Plato and Aristotle. And John Wilde is not a contemporary thinker, really. He's died some years ago, but I was introduced to him by a friend of mine, and he has this sort of magnificent commentary on Plato and Aristotle called Plato's Theory of Man. But in many ways, al-Farabi's view here is that Plato and Aristotle are very much unified, actually. So from Aristotle, what we'll see is that al-Farabi largely pulls from the logic, the natural philosophy, the ethics, and the metaphysics. Whereas from Plato, he really pulls out the politics. So in many ways, these thinkers are al-Farabi. You could think of him perhaps as a synthesis in his own thinking between Plato's politics and then Aristotle's natural philosophy. There was dispute between later thinkers regarding how we ought to really understand al-Farabi's work. For instance, was he actually in the business of harmonizing Islamic doctrines with philosophical teachings? Or was he primarily a philosopher and he just saw religion as having a largely political sort of role and a political use? So there's a question that later medieval thinkers would have, particularly Islamic thinkers, regarding the nature of his theology and whether or not this is more of a natural philosophy that's being harmonized with Islamic doctrines, or whether or not he's really just an Aristotelian, and then religion is sort of a secondary consideration. I think from his perspective, he probably would think that he'd probably reject both questions. I think, but I don't know. There was a dispute in terms of how he's understood within the later medieval scholarship. What we do know is that for al-Farabi, God is understood as a sort of Neoplatonic one. Aristotle's divine thought that's thinking itself, the unmoved mover. And we're going to really lay out what his arguments are regarding God, and that's going to be sort of the focus of the philosophical discussion to come. But what we will see is that for him, of course, God is one, and you can see that's critical and central to Islamic teaching. God is knowing, God is true, God is living. The attributes of God, he argues, are actually identical with God's essence. God is incorporeal. There's a little spelling error there. So God is not a physical object, but God is pure intellect, in fact. and God is the creator of all things that exist. So you can see here, this isn't exactly the articulation that Aristotle gives regarding his divine essence, but in many ways it is similar to both Aristotle and Plato. But of course, you see organized throughout all of it is the sense of Islamic teaching as well. Of course, Aristotle would argue that it's one as well. So this is sort of general caricature, picture, framework you can use as we're talking about al-Farabi and his philosophy of God. Now, the other thing we're going to really talk about today is the origin of the world. Not so much the origin of the world, but his theory of emanation. And here the notion is that God is a being that contemplates himself or itself. And so God is always actually, in the purest sense, God is an unmoved mover that's purely just a thinking thing that's thinking itself. So God's contemplating itself, but from that contemplation, al-Farabi argues that God's intellect arises, and this is what is known as the first emanation. And we're gonna talk a lot about this here in a moment. Here, there's actually 9 levels of emanations, and the final emanation is the emanation of the agent intellect. So we're going to talk about that today. So al-Farabi thinks that God is contemplating himself in his perfect infinite unity, but that from that, as it were, there's emanations of God's being which allow for other modes of reality, and ultimately this is the source for the origin of the world, the physical world. Now, the other thing here is that each of these emanations has a celestial sphere. So it seems to be what al-Farabi is doing is he has a theory of emanations that ultimately extends and is unified with his view of cosmology, which largely seems to come from Aristotle. So there's 9 emanations, and there's 9 celestial spheres, right? So the first 8 spheres are eternal, right? And this is the sphere of the fixed stars: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. But then there's also the sublunar celestial sphere, which is the one that we're existing in. We're underneath the Moon, and this is where the generation and corruptions of things occur. Now, of course, it's clear if you study astronomy that there's problems with this theory right from the get-go. We have to realize that al-Farabi's working with what he has, right? They don't, so far as I know, they don't have sophisticated telescopes to recognize that for instance, there's dirt on the Moon, there's clouds on Venus, etc., right? So, but his view here, it largely comes from Aristotle's own geocentric model for his cosmology. And the idea is that there's the sublunar, and then outside of those are these other celestial spheres. And as these spheres move and rotate in a cyclical fashion, which is an eternal formation, that's why we're seeing the stars and the sun and all of these different things move in our skies. But his view is that these other spheres are eternal, and the sublunar is, where we have generation and corruption. Now notice this is a really alien perspective, I think, for most of us, particularly because today we have a conception of contemporary or modern physics or Newtonian physics, or you could go beyond that. But our assumption is that all of these physical properties of motion are everywhere else, right? No matter the galaxy, no matter the planet. And so there's a very, very sort of different thing here. And in many ways, I think that al-Farabi's philosophical considerations for his theory of emanation is what is really the guideline in terms of the cosmology rather than observation, or rather than a sort of astronomical account. So it really is a philosophical account, and one that I think is largely defunct today, at least in a literal sense. Now, al-Farabi, we're also going to talk a little bit about his doctrine of the intellect. And this was the way in which he sought to improve Aristotle's own account. There's actually 4 senses of intellect. There's the faculty of the human soul, and this is sort of thinking in potentiality, right? It's your ability to potentially think. And there's the second sort of sense of the intellect is intellectual abstraction, and this he refers to as the intellect in terms of its actuality. And then 3, there's thinking the intelligibles within it. So this is about thinking about the things which are intelligible in thinking. And this is the acquired intellect for him. And then finally, there's the agent intellect, sense of the agent intellect, and this is the efficient cause of thinking. So you can notice here, and if you're not familiar again with Aristotle, I encourage you to go take a look at my video on Aristotle's metaphysics here, and his physics, because in many ways that you can see that he's utilizing the notion of potentiality and actuality. He's utilizing the notion of the agent intellect here. So you have a sense in which his very conception of the intellect itself is informed and is consistent and systematized with his broader, with the broader account of Aristotle. And he thinks that by articulating the intellect in these various senses, we can get more mileage, if you will, out of the Aristotelian framework. There is, of course, an account of prophecy that al-Farabi gives, and I've sort of highlighted sort of three different sort of passages just to sort of give you a sense, right? The prophet is not merely someone arbitrarily selected by God for his prophetic office, but someone who's possessed of all human perfections. And by the way, this is coming from the preface, the editor of the book we're using, if we're interpreting this. We're using, again, the Hackett Anthology of Medieval Philosophy, so you can take a look at that. I discussed it in the very first video, so if you need to review where this is at. But this is just in the opening introduction to al-Farabi. So here the idea is that the prophet is someone who's actually perfect, right? And he goes on, not only must the prophet possess a healthy constitution and have moral virtues, intellectual perfection, and so forth, but he must also have a well-developed faculty of imagination. And once these perfections have been attained, the prophet assumes a twofold role. As a philosopher, his acquired intellect will be in contact with the agent intellect from which it receives a kind of illumination. Right? Remember, the agent intellect is the final layer of emanation that's coming from God's being. And the way you can really think about it, and this you can see the resonance here with even with Plato, is that he thinks of God as like the sun doing its own thing, but light comes and has effects on things, and that's these sort of layers of emanation. The final is agent intellect. So the first thing here is that the prophet, of course, if he's talking about the prophet, he of course is talking about Muhammad, the prophet Muhammad. Pardon me. And so obviously, yeah. But there's this philosophical notion, right? And al-Farabi insists, he goes on, that the prophetic intellect will never become identical with the agent intellect. So that means that the prophet doesn't become God. So the perfection there's always a divide. But at the same time, he does admit that the agent intellect is a kind of form for the acquired intellect of the prophet. But besides being an accomplished philosopher, the prophet is also a statesman. And so there you have this sort of interesting critical link, both between the philosophical side of the prophet and the political side. And here it's important to recognize the way in which the prophet Muhammad also was a political figure. So you can see there is an interesting account of prophecy that goes in here into the text, or at least into al-Farabi. Now, the other thing, let's talk a little bit about al-Farabi and his politics. So man is a political animal by nature. So that sort of comes from both, I guess, Plato and Aristotle. Happiness is attained within the state. So the way in which one gains happiness is by living in a certain sort of political constitution. Now, what is the ideal state? The ideal state concerns the orderly arrangement of its citizens. Remember, in Plato divides, in the Republic, he divides the city into really sort of two classes, and out of that second class comes the philosopher king, or if you will, three classes. But really, comes right out of Plato, right? On the one hand, you have the masses or the artisans. On the other hand, you have the guardians of the elite. Now, ultimately, for al-Farabi, the classes he just divides is the elite and the masses, and the elite are able to understand by intellectual demonstration, whereas the masses understand through persuasion. And I found that particularly interesting because it certainly seems to me that this is maybe a way in which we can look at our own political order. It does seem to be that, for instance, American politics really focuses on a type of persuasion of the masses. And what we don't really see is an intellectual demonstration regarding policy arguments or things like that. So that's sort of interesting to think about. And it seems to be this is coming from Plato, but there seems to be something true there. The ideal state, though, requires a singular ruler, he thinks, in the sense that there's a singular God. So who is this singular ruler? Well, they're the prophet, they're the philosopher, they're the legislature, they're the imam. The imam here just means leader in this context. So you can see here the Prophet Muhammad, of course, fits the ideal state ruler in the Platonic sense. So here we see is that at the end of the day, though, for al-Farabi, it appears that philosophy contains the final truth, whereas religion contains the image of the truth. So this is something where you can start to understand how other later theological thinkers would criticize al-Farabi and sort of ask, what is he up to here? Because it appears that if there's a logical priority between philosophy and theology, I should say theology, but philosophy and religion, philosophy has the logical priority. And why would that be the case? Well, remember, if the final emanation of God is the agent intellect, and that is the efficient cause of our ability to think, and if philosophy is simultaneously an intellectual endeavor in a highly abstract sense, then that means that philosophy, through intellect, allows one to attain or to recognize or articulate the sort of final truth of things. But whereas religion, and think here about the way in which religious texts tell stories, for instance, and paint pictures, there's a way, and then here you not just religion in the sense of the text of a religion, which of course within Islam is holy. The Quran is, of course, there are other holy texts for Islam as well as within other religions, right? So we're not just talking about the text, but also the way in which people live within the religion. The religion contains the image, ultimately, of the final truth. And notice that this is a Platonic notion as well, right? That ultimately the philosopher king or the prophet is the person who ultimately can actually gain the true wisdom, and that the society is organized and images are crafted in order to help the masses. So not everyone is going to be able to get to the philosophical truth of things. And in that sense, what we have is for the masses, and I think for the elite, religion is for both, but you can see philosophy is not necessarily for both. Now, quick on his biography, and again, as you can tell, I'm not an expert in al-Farabi, but I hope this is, so I'm still learning this myself as well, so I'll just sort of put that out there. But he was born in 870 in Farah, which is Turkestan. He studied in Khorasan as well as in Baghdad. In 942, he accepted an invitation to the court of Saif al-Dawla. And he actually spent most of his life in Aleppo, which of course is contemporary Syria today. He actually lived a fairly ascetic life. Ascetic life. So he lived a minimalist lifestyle. I mean, he was inclined towards religious mysticism. He died in 950. So that's a very, very brief biography. Of course, you can learn more about al-Farabi because there's an enormous amount of literature on this philosopher, given his impact. Now, the text we're going to be taking a look at, we're going to be looking at some of the excerpts and some of the discussions that are laid out in al-Farabi's The Principles of Existing Things. Now, to be clear, he wrote actually many, many, many books. He has a huge CV, if you will. So we're just going to take a look at this, The Principles of Existing Things, and we're going to see that really what he's after about articulating here is a question about ultimately the theory of emanation and its relationship to ourselves and to God. And that's kind of the focus of the rest of our discussion today. So let's sort of start here with part one of that text. It's sort of part one of our lecture as well. And the principles of existing things. Now, let's start here and just talk about what a principle is. So al-Farabi doesn't define what a principle is. He suspects you already know, but I think it might be helpful in the video introduction here to talk about what we mean by it when we talk about something being a principle. Right. So first, in the general sense, a principle you can think of as essentially a rule that guides something intellectually or guides something in some way. So, for instance, but the other thing here is that a principle cannot be proven within the science that uses that principle. This comes from Aristotle. So, for instance, if take for instance the principle of cause and effect, causality. That we don't normally think of causality as a principle, but think about it in terms of physics, right? Physics is the study of how things move through time. You see, I have my NASA cup. So NASA is all about physics. Physics requires motion, and there's an effect between one type of motion and its effect on other things, right? So cause and effect relationships is sort of part and parcel to our whole experience of the world. But what we can say is that in a certain way, cause and effect is a principle for physics. It's a principle because physics requires the axiom that there is such a thing as cause and effect. You can't prove cause and effect by looking at physical things, right? And for instance, famously, David Hume, a modern philosopher, not contemporary, but a modern philosopher, right? He says, for instance, how do you know that there's cause and effect relationships in the world? The answer is you see. So, for instance, this is moving, and then I hit it, and I hear a sound. For instance, I have a cause, and then I have an effect. But notice here is that I can watch very closely one event and then another event occur. But what I never really see is the necessary relationship between event A and event B. I only know that there's a cause and effect relationship because it happens over and over and over. But what does that mean? It means that a strict observation of motion or of a cause and effect event, a strict observation will not allow us to observe cause and effect. Right? Cause and effect is rather something that we recognize within the state of existing things that move about and cause effects. So that means that cause and effect is like a principle. So now let's move away because we're not talking about cause and effect in this video. But what we can say is that each one of these causes is a principle for some other set, some other relationship. And so this is why, so you can see here there's 6 types of principles. The first principle is the first cause of all things, and of course this is, in the Aristotelian sense, it's the unmoved mover, but of course here it's also an unmoved mover, but yet it moves, and so what we're going to see here is that the first cause is one, it's a singular unity, and that from this first cause, these other principles emerge, such as secondary causes. Third is the active intellect, you have the fourth, the soul, and then finally, 5 and 6, you have form and matter, which are both essential for Aristotle's physics. Now, you'll notice here that you'll start to recognize, if you're familiar with Aristotle, that al-Farabi is utilizing and thinking about all the things that Aristotle is, but in a slightly different way. So the first thing is, when we talk about the principles of things, these principles get divided into these 6 levels. The first cause is singular, it's one, whereas all the others are plural, or there are many. On the other hand, al-Farabi says that the first 3 causes are not bodies, nor are they in bodies. So that means that the first 3 principles are really just intellectual principles. They're not principles that exist in space. They're not bodies themselves, so you can't observe them, and nor are they in the bodies, so you can't find them or deduce them from bodies. The last 3 principles, 4, 5, and 6, the soul, form, and matter, these are in bodies, but they're not bodies as such. And this is important because you're thinking, well, wait a second, is it matter? Doesn't matter have extension in space? But remember here is that matter in and of itself, if it has no form, doesn't exist, because anything that's matter, put it this way. So I have a coffee cup here. The coffee cup has both form and matter. Its matter is its ceramic stuff that it's made of, and its form is the fact that it's in this type of shape. But notice here that the only way I can ever recognize a form is if there's matter, and the only way I can ever have matter is if it's in a shape. So that means that they're in the bodies, but they're not the bodies themselves. And also you can think of the soul here as being distinct from the body in an important sense. Okay? So there's 6 genera of bodies. So when we talk about bodies, what types of bodies are there in the world? And here you might think, what type of things are there in the world in the most substantial sense? Well, there's celestial bodies. So you have the sun, and you have the moon, etc. There are also rational animals. That's humans, right? You also have 3 non-rational animals. So for instance, you can't see it, but my cat is sitting right next to me. So there are non-rational animals. My cat doesn't have reason. I'm sorry about to tell him that. Number 4, there's plants. So you have vegetative types of life. Number 5, you have minerals, which are not living as such. And then within the minerals, then you have what al-Farabi says are the 4 elements. And here he's talking about the 4 elements that are articulated in the antiquity. Right? Earth, air, fire, and water. Right? Each of which has a pre-Socratic philosopher associated with, and Aristotle also discussed the 4 elements. Now, today we know that there are not 4 elements, but we do have an elemental theory of things. Now, for us, the elements are not the things that we label as elements on the periodic table of elements, things like oxygen, etc. But the elements for us are rather something like atoms, or if we go smaller still, we might say that they're quarks, or smaller still, theoretically, maybe the elements are actually strings, and you have string theory. So in many ways, the question of what the elements are has not been resolved today. But we still essentially think that everything must be made of some sort of elements. So in many ways, even if this is no longer accurate physicalist picture of the world, it does resemble in many ways a rational organization of things that's consistent with our own. And he thinks that you have these sort of different types of bodies. Now, earlier we talked about the difference between species and genus, right, in the last video. Now, this means that when we're talking about body, the genus of bodies, that means that these are, if you will, the categories or the types of bodies which are possible. Now, if you take all 6 of these together, for al-Farabi, that is the universe. So that comprises everything in the universe that we think of as being in the universe. At least that's how he defines it. Now, of course, God is in the universe, but God is not a body. And so when we talk about things cosmologically in terms of the universe, we're talking about the embodied part of the universe, if you will. And so that's sort of a very important point. And the other thing here is that, of course, al-Farabi would agree that God can be known through revelation, because God reveals himself to the prophet as well as to Abraham. But al-Farabi also thinks that, right, along with Aristotle, that ultimately the philosophical truth of the nature of God is given through the intellect, and is given through reasoning here. Now, the causes. So when we talk about the causes, now in philosophy there's lots of different causes discussed. The first cause, of course, is the divine cause. That's the cause of all things. It's first in the most pure sense, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. The secondary causes, though, these are the things which are the causes of the universe, right? These are the things that actually enable and create the physical bodies of the universe. So you have the highest level, which entails the existence of the first heaven, and all the way to the lowest level, which entails the existence of the orbits containing the moons. And in between are other causes. So you have the highest of the, so put it this way, you have the secondary causes, and then within the secondary causes, you have a hierarchy of ordering of those causes. The highest is the closest to the divine, to the first heaven, whereas the lowest is closest to us. And there's the whole range of secondary causes in between. And each of these entails a sphere. And so I put up here a little model that I pulled from the internet here of sort of what the cosmology looked like in an Aristotelian world. And you can sort of see here, now I should say that this image does not come from al-Farabi, nor do I think it's actually depicting al-Farabi's model. But I wanted to put this in here just so you get a sense of what we're talking about here, right? So we're down here, and then you've got the moon is this sort of first layer, celestial, and then you've got Mercury, Venus, Mars, and so on and so forth. And you can see where the sun is, right? And their idea was that these things would just go in circles, and so they're eternal, etc. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of what these secondary causes are. They're obviously linked to each of these spheres, these categorical spheres in the celestial bodies. Now, the function of the active intellect, we're going to see the active intellect is really, really critical level of emanation for al-Farabi. And so I pulled this quote from his text where he says to watch that the active intellect watches over the rational animal and endeavors to have him reach the highest level of perfection that man can reach, namely ultimate happiness, which is for man to arrive at the level of active intellect. So we're going to see here that for him, God is one, but that God has these layers of emanation. At the bottom here, you have the active intellect, and the active intellect is ultimately what is relating to us as human beings. And the active intellect is seeking to allow us through our reasoning to attain perfection, or the type of perfection that's possible for us as the type of beings we are. But ultimately, this is the ultimate happiness that we're after. Now, the active intellect itself is singular, right? But it accommodates, quote, whatever part of the rational animal is freed from matter and attains happiness. You can see there's a sense of the ascetic nature of al-Farabi's life here, right? Al-Farabi didn't believe, as an ascetic, he didn't accumulate lots of material goods and try to become wealthy, etc. Right? Rather, right, you can see why he didn't, at least in his view, is because ultimately to attain happiness is to engage in the intellect, and ultimately to reach towards the active intellect, which is sort of which is sort of trying to, if you will, God's trying to put his hand down and pull us up, as it will. But this is an intellectual activity. And this is why, for instance, probably most of the masses are only persuaded by persuasion rather than actually reasoning, mainly because they're not freed from matter, right? So the active intellect is a sort of protective spirit, actually. And sorry, I apologize. I keep seeing like errors in the copy editing errors. So my apologies for that. But the active intellect is a sort of protective spirit. He actually calls it the Holy Spirit. So that's the spirit in which God works with human beings. Now, at the level of the soul, right? So we've talked about the soul. There are many principles. Why are there many principles? Because there's different types of souls. There's animal souls and there's rational souls, right? And this, of course, you can see directly is related to Aristotle's own conception of the soul, where there's three different types of soul, the rational being the highest. So there are many principles of the soul, and you can see here is that, for instance, within the rational animal, the various principles we recognize are reason, of course, is the critical one. We've got appetite, though. So, for instance, as I'm giving this discussion here, I'm occasionally getting thirsty. So that means there's a part of my soul, there's a part of the being that I am that is pushing me towards my desires. So you have appetite. You also have imagination. So, and here, to be clear, imagination is meant in a much more literal sense that it's likely that most of us think of the imagination. Most of us think of the imagination as the part of us that allows us to be creative and come up with different ideas. And that's kind of true, but the imagination here is really focused on the idea of imaging, right? So we have the ability to image the world. So, for instance, as I record this video, I'm looking at the screen, which means that there's a principle within me that allows my mind to articulate images and then to use those images to give the lecture or whatever, and to find my way around the world. And then finally, I also have a principle of sensory perception. So I can touch things, and for instance, you can't tell it, but this coffee cup's a little warm. So that's given to me through my sensory perception. So, and there still could be other parts, though those are the ones he lists out in this text. But it seems to me there's probably other principles we could articulate. Now, reason's the critical one here, because ultimately what we want to understand is the relationship between the rational soul and the active intellect. Okay, so there's two parts of the soul, of reasoning. You have theoretical faculties and you have practical faculties. So, for instance, the practical faculties, it's pretty clear, refer to our sort of ability to deliberate about how to do things in a practical sense It also is vocational for him. So the sort of things that we do in our vocation is a utilization of our practical reasoning. And finally, we also have our theoretical faculties, which is the sort of highest, more abstract form of reasoning, the thing we're doing in philosophy here, right? In fact, here's the other faculties we can lay out. So we've got theoretical faculties, which gain knowledge of anything that that we don't act upon in any way. We have practical faculties where we gain knowledge of things that are acted upon by our volition. We have vocational faculties, which allow us to acquire crafts and sciences and vocations. So think about, you have a faculty, he thinks, that enables you to become, for instance, a chef, and to be able to cut vegetables and cook and do all that sort of at the same time requires a sort of faculty of reasoning that allows that. You also have deliberative faculties, which allow for thinking and reflection. Appetite, as we mentioned, you have appetite, faculties for the appetites to seek out or to flee. So there, an appetite is either something you desire or something you desire not to have. You have the imagination, which is where you store your impressions of objects and the senses. And then finally, you have these sensory perceptions, which is you've got your five senses. So again, notice here that al-Farabi is linking up a whole range of different things, all the way from the physics up into the metaphysics, the ethics, and the politics. So you have a sort of systematic, paradigmatic view. Now, the first cause, let's go there. So the first cause is God, is the divine in and of itself, right? And the first cause is actually intellecting itself. So the first cause, remember, doesn't have a body, and nor is it in a body, but it actually has intellection. And what is the first cause thinking about? The first cause is thinking about the first cause. The first cause is God is thinking about God. God is contemplating Godness, right? And in fact, in this case, what we're going to see is that for the first cause, the active intellect of thinking and the object of thinking are one and the same, right? So there's a fundamental unity in God as the first cause. Now, the active intellect is the sort of next layer in which the intellect where the active intellect is thinking about the first cause as well as the other causes. So take a look at this passage from his text. He writes, the active intellect is what makes them actual intelligibles. It makes some of them actual intellects by raising them from their level of existence to a level higher than one given them by nature. So with nature we're given an intellect, but the active intellect pulls us into a higher level of existence. So for example, he says, the rational faculty by virtue of which man is not in its substance an actual intellect, and was not given by nature to be an actual intellect. Instead, the active intellect causes it to become an actual intellect and makes everything else an actual intelligible for the rational faculty. So you can see here is that his al-Farabi's metaphysical thinking is tightly interwoven into his epistemology, because namely, one does not really gain knowledge, at least not of higher things, unless it's through the emanation of the active intellect. So let's go here to the next phrase. So what exactly is the relationship between the active intellect and humanity? So how are we supposed to understand this relationship? And he says, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's the way in which the sun is related to our vision. So when you go outside, the sun is out there. It's up there doing its thing, irrespective of you, right? The sun is not concerned with you. But out of the sun comes light. And it's with that light that I'm able to see things within a field of experience if I'm outside, of course. And even if you say, well, what about the light bulbs and this sort of thing? Well, all of that's energy that's coming from the sun. So the sun is the source of the light which enables us to see. So we're the seers, right? But without the light, there's nothing to be seen. So in that same way, the active intellect provides, if you will, the medium by which we're able to have intellection, by which we're able to gain knowledge through our thinking. He says, the sun gives light to vision, and by the light acquired from the sun, vision actually sees, when before it had only had the potential to see. By that light, vision sees the sun itself, which is the cause of its actual seeing, and furthermore actually sees the colors that previously were only potentially the objects of vision. The vision that was potentially thereby becomes actual. In the same manner, the active intellect provides man with something that it imprints in his rational faculty, and the relation of that thing to the rational soul is like the light of vision. So there we go, right? And he goes on, it is by reason of this thing that the rational soul intellects the active intellect, that the things that are potentially intelligible become actually intelligible, and that man, who is potentially an intellect, becomes actually and perfectly an intellect, and until he all but reaches the rank of the active intellect. So man becomes an intellect per se after he was not, and an intelligible per se after he was not, and a divine substance after being a material one. This is what the active intellect does, and this is why it's called the active intellect. So its activity is in terms of enabling the capabilities for human beings to actualize their ability to know, but ultimately, in order for them to go beyond their material world realm, and ultimately to achieve not a level of the active intellect, but to achieve a very high intellectual level, right? And ultimately, in this, you can see how a sort of mysticism probably comes into the equation here. So this is a sort of, if you will, the epistemology, if you will. Now let's talk about form and matter. And here I think that it's clear, again, that he's really pulling from the analysis of Aristotle. He says form is in the corporeal substance, the way that the shape of bed is in the bed, and the matter being the wood of the bed, right? And it's the same example I gave as the Kavika, of course. He gives the example of a wooden bed. But form here cannot exist without matter, and matter only exists for the sake of form. Now, this sort of interesting here we're going to see is that one of the things that's weird here is that forms are actually higher up on the chain, if you will, of the intellect than matter is, but forms can go out of existence. So form is what allows us to recognize the decay and the generation of things, or the corruption and the generation of things. Because the only way, so for instance, if you take, for instance, an old man, right, or maybe I'm an old man, right, you can go back and look at my older videos, and you can see I'm starting to get a little older, which I'm not happy about. But what is it you see? The way you recognize that someone is in a state of decay, that they're becoming older, is that their form is changing. And the way in which you recognize that something is coming into being, right, think about a mother who becomes pregnant, right? You can't see the baby, but you can see her form change. And that form, of course, is because the baby's form is changing. So generation of things is also understood by form. But notice that form always requires matter. But what's interesting here is he says that matter exists for the sake of form. So that's the reason you have matter, is so you can have these forms. One of the things that's interesting, though, is he's going to say that matter never goes out of existence. So matter has a sort of almost eternal quality to it that form doesn't, which is sort of an interesting thing. He says here, for instance, prime matter cannot exist devoid of a given form. Okay, now prime matter is, what does he mean by prime matter? Prime matter is the notion of matter without any form, right? It's the abstraction of matter, of the idea of there being matter without any sort of shape. So it's prime matter. Now, we never experience prime matter. We only experience things that are already informed, right? So prime matter, though, cannot exist without a given form, because if it's existing, it always has a form. Matter, then, is a principle and a cause solely by way of being the subject for bearing the form. It's not an agent, nor an end, nor something that can exist independently of some form, right? So, but you can put it this way, is that the reason we have matter, from al-Farabi's perspective, is so that forms can exist. It's a cause, but it's not an agent, so it's not doing something. It's not the goal of the form is to be in matter, but it's required of matter. So let's see here. Let's talk about souls. The next thing here is, okay, a soul, if it does not seek perfection and undertakes actions towards that end, exists only as potentialities and configurations. So an important point here is that he's also linking here the notion of form. He's linking the notion of the active intellect and the way God is helping us and actualizing our potential. And he's linking it with the idea of the soul. So the soul is actually exists in a state of potentiality, and its activities are always organized towards their sort of seeking of perfection, sort of an improvement. Now, there's different orders of form, right? So the elements refer to the lowest organization of form, for instance. I'm sort of changing the subject a little bit here, but he sort of mentions this, and I thought it was important here to recognize that he's consistent here that the soul is actualized by the active intellect, and it exists only potentiality until that point. Now, what are the different orders of form? Now, the elements refer to the lowest organization of form. So, if you will, atoms or whatever is at the very bottom of everything, these basic elements are the lowest potential organization of form. And the higher the form, the more complex the configuration. And each of these levels is really a measure of the complexity. So, for instance, to give you a sort of example, a low level of complexity here is the periodic table of elements, where we have atoms. And notice that each one of the atoms, according to the periodic table, and I'm not going to try to explain the periodic table right here, but each one of these atoms, ultimately, each one of these elements refers to an organization of the atoms themselves. And so that's a very low level of organization when you compare it with, for instance, a library. I'm pretty sure this is the library at Columbia University. And here what we see here is that, for instance, notice that this building here is composed of many, many different elements within its organization and many, many different atoms. And so there's levels and degrees in terms of the arrangement of the elements, which means that this is the corresponding relationship between form and matter. So you can sort of, that's why, for instance, you can go to the library, and then you can pull out your microscope and look at, or not really see the elements, but you can see there's smaller bits that everything is made of. And so one of the problems here is, well, what's the form? And here, what al-Farabi's done is says, well, there's levels and degrees of form based upon configuration and organization. So of the things which exist, form and prime matter, are the most deficient, he says. So of all the things which exist, from God at the top all the way down to us, form and prime matter are the most deficient. What exactly does that mean? That's why I put a sort of question mark. Well, in order to exist, form and matter need each other, right? So that's the first thing. So they're deficient in the sense that neither is self-sufficient, right? So the perfection, and also consider the idea that the perfection of a substance always requires a change in the form of something. And I sort of gave an example. People talk about the idea that a nation should try to become that the United States should try to become a more perfect union. I think this comes from the Gettysburg Address, right? But ask yourself, what would it mean for any of us, or the nation, or any configuration of form and matter to become more perfect? Well, its perfection always would mean a change in form. So that's an important thing. And the other thing is, that means that there's always a different prime matter is reorganized in some way. He says it's by virtue of its form that the body has its more perfect state of being, that is to say, its actual existence. Whereas it's by virtue of its matter that the body has its more deficient state of being, that is to say, its potential existence. So here we see, for instance, that potentiality and actuality, right, are both, potentiality is a less perfect state of being than actuality. Because what is actuality? Potentiality just means that the form could be, and that it's somehow, that potential nature is somehow within the substance, but then it gets actualized through a change of form. And that's what a movement of perfection would have to be, right? For at least an embodied being. So that means that matter doesn't need a subject to exist, but form does. So in a certain sense, matter is superior to form, because matter doesn't have a contrary to its privation, right? So, for instance, there's no opposite of matter, right? There's no contrary of matter, because the opposite of matter would be something that had no matter, which is non-existent. If it's non-existent, then it's not a contrary relationship. So matter is superior to form, because form, you can have contrary forms next to each other, and this can't be the case. So for instance, on contraries, al-Farabi says anything that has a privation or a contrary cannot exist forever, which means that matter does exist forever, because matter is a subject for contrary forms. Here's sort of example. So you can see there's two contrary forms here, and they're both side by side. But that's because the contrary relationship is informed. We couldn't make this with matter. You can't put matter next to the opposite, the inverse of matter. Now, it's interesting here because maybe some of you are thinking, well, what about dark matter? Isn't that the inverse? And maybe it is. But I'm not a physicist, so I'm not going to try to bring that into the discussion on al-Farabi, which would be interesting because maybe contemporary physics would invalidate this. I'm not sure. I'll let the physicists determine that. But what we can say is from al-Farabi's perspective and from this Aristotelian model, matter receives all the contraries equally, right? Notice matter doesn't get upset when it changes form. It just does. So now we have to talk about what are non-corporeal forms. So in these forms, there's no matter and form deficiency. So this means that really I think we have to say there's two different ways of talking about form. So for instance, mathematics articulates non-corporeal forms. So the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is a form that has to do, or this is really a principle or a consequence of the form of an equilateral triangle, or not an equilateral triangle, I'm sorry, a right angle triangle. And it's always the same, it never changes. But now notice that it doesn't have matter and it doesn't have form, at least in a substantial sense, but it does have form, an intellectual type of form, which is non-corporeal. And that form has no deficiencies. It doesn't decay over time or anything, right? But here, these non-corporeal forms like mathematics and ultimately these other intellectual forms that one is able to articulate, think about Plato here, they don't exist for the sake of something. These forms don't exist for the sake of something else, right? Because their existence seems to be independent. He says their existence is bestowed on them by something more perfect in existence than they are. So there is this type of deficiency maybe in them. And ultimately what he's trying to articulate here is that on the one hand, they don't exist, the triangles and the Pythagorean theorem doesn't exist for us down here, right? But it does seem that they have to gain their existence from something still higher, a higher type of form. So that means that it's not that they have a deficiency in terms of generation or corruption, but they have a deficiency in the sense that they are not their own efficient cause, right? So there is a type of deficiency, which means that what we're really talking about are layers or levels of perfection in terms of existence. Now what's wrong here is that, well, there's no secondary causes can find perfection in themselves alone. That's the way al-Farabi articulates the problem. There's no level of existence is self-sufficient except for the first cause. And here's a sort of picture of the universe's creation, and I assume this is dark matter or something. I didn't make this. But at the level here, notice that in our own model, right, we have the Big Bang. Now, obviously, al-Farabi doesn't articulate or agree with the Big Bang or anything, but sort of I like this image here because the image sort of shows that there's a sort of central point, a first cause. And I think that this is not the model of the universe al-Farabi has, clearly, right? But what we can say is that he does think that whatever starts it all, the first cause is the only thing that is self-sufficient. That's the only thing. And that's why God's intellection is the same as the object of what God is intellecting. That's the self-sufficiency of the unmoved mover. And there's no level of existence except for that first cause, which is self-sufficient. So they're all organized in this hierarchy. Now, we can talk here, in al-Farabi, you can see is sort of bouncing around a little bit. We can also talk about the souls and the faculties of animals. Now, we already mentioned that the faculties of animals include sensory perception and imagination, right? We've talked about the rational side of things, and I'm sure we'll get there again. But what about these other things, right? What kind of perfection is there in the faculty of sensation, or the ability to have images of the things you see? His answer is that perfection is really something like whether or not it's accurate, whether or not there's a resemblance of things, right? So the accuracy of resemblance is the type of perfection he thinks that these other faculties of the soul, the animal soul, include. So then we can say, well, what exactly does rationality add to the equation? He writes, when the rational part of the soul is perfected, and it then becomes an actual intellect, remember it goes from potential to actual, it very much resembles the separate things, except that it receives perfection, actuality, and splendor, adornment, and the beauty of existence only by intellecting not just the things above it in rank, but also the things below it in rank, making the multiplicity in what affords its very substance great. So the idea here is that, for instance, my faculty of sight only allows me to see things outside of me, it only allows me to see. But my reasoning allows me not just to understand the things I'm seeing, but also to understand the reasons I'm seeing. So, as it were, the rational, the active intellect of the individual allows a multiplicity of knowledge that the other senses and other faculties and other parts of the soul are not able to attain. So the rational soul is really critical then, right? Now, if we're going to contrast this with the first cause, we would say that, well, the first cause has no deficiency. It's absolutely prior. It also has to be simple because it can't be divided. And it's also a divine contemplation of the divine, or at least that's how we're going to articulate it, since it's an intellect, and intellects intellect things. So what is the simple intellectual substance? It's the intellect that intellects itself. And it can't be divided, so that means it's not a quantity as such, and it has no contrary. The first cause, therefore, has to be one. It has to be singular. And here, I want you to see and recognize the important relationship that al-Farabi's philosophical discussion here has ultimately with the religious discussion here in terms of the singular nature of God. Al-Farabi writes, in light of this, its existence by which it, and notice he's capitalizing it here, so he's talking about the divine one. In light of this, its existence by which it's distinguished from all other beings also cannot be other than that by which it is in existence in itself. Therefore, its distinction from everything else is through a unity that is its being. One of the meanings of unity is the proper existence by which every existent is distinguished from another. And it is by virtue of this that each existent is called one, in the sense that it has an existence proper to it alone, and this particular connotation of the term unity goes along with existence. In this respect, the first is also one, and more deserving of that name and connotation than anything else. So you might want to pause the video and read that again, but you can see here is that when one says that God is one, in the Islamic world, al-Farabi, or any world really, the idea here is that we don't just mean monotheism, there's just one, but there's a sense in which we can really take this to a very, very deep level. It's oneness in the most essential sense of oneness. So the first cause is absolutely one. Now the first, therefore, does not have matter, right? So the first is intellect, which means that it has intellectual intelligibility and it intellects itself, right? Which means, of course, it's eternal as well, right? The first cause is God is. So the first cause is both knower and known, right? Which is sort of interesting. It's both the thing which knows itself and it's the thing that it knows about itself. So perfect knowledge, he says, quote, is the complete knowledge that always belongs to what is always eternal. Likewise, the first is wise, not knowledge, that it receives through knowing something outside of itself. It is sufficient in itself to be wise in knowing itself. Now, there's a question here about whether or not what we really have created is a circular argument. And whether or not, and al-Farabi in a certain way would say, yes, it is circular, but it's a virtuous circularity because it's the first cause. Or you could say it's not a circularity because it's simple. Anyway, there's a sort of interesting question here. Later philosophers and modern philosophers are much more critical in this sense. Now, the first is beautiful beyond understanding. So there's also an aesthetic dimension to this. It's the source of beauty itself. And here you can see the way in which al-Farabi recognizes a unity between Aristotle's conception of the first mover and ultimately Plato's conception, right, of the good. Now, in light of this, he writes, its existence by which it is distinguished from all other beings and cannot be other than that which exists itself, Oh, hold on. I think I have made a mistake here. I put this quote in twice, so my apologies. Um, it wasn't the quote. I accidentally did the wrong quote here. So anyway, but what we can say here, because I don't want to go back and redo all this, what we can say is that the first is beautiful beyond understanding, because in a certain sense we cannot really understand it, but it's where all beauty emanates from. Now he does say that the first here is the first thing that's desired and the first thing that's beloved, right? So you can see here is that the more a person is attached to matter and not intellect, then that means that there's a deficiency in the things they desire, the things they love. But the highest form of intellectual life is one where we desire the first itself, and that is the thing that is loved the most. So existence in the first. The first does not aim to create the existence of other things. The first does not gain a perfection by creating, nor does the first need anything other than its own being. So when we say that God, the unmoved mover, we say that God is one and he's the first cause, then that means when we say that God is intellecting itself, that means that God doesn't exist to create us, right? And God's not isn't made better or more perfect by creating us, nor does God need anything other than God, right? So how do we talk about this first thing? Well, what we can say is that what's the relationship of creation to all this, right? Well, al-Farabi says the terms that should be employed for the first are the terms that designate those existence among us that are perfect and excellent, without, however, anything of those terms designating the excellence and perfection that the first has, in the way that those terms customarily designating such existence among us. So in a certain way, there's a way in which there's a sort of ineffable quality to the first. We can't actually even articulate God. It's kind of like looking at the sun. When you look at the sun, you can't actually see the sun because you're blinded by its beauty, I suppose. Now, one thing here is that you can notice that means that there's a problem with language here, which means that our language is always only reaching towards, our intellectual language is only reaching towards the first. It never actually can get there, right? He says the terms that designate the perfection and excellence pertaining to the things among us include the following, right? Sometimes they belong to something in itself, and sometimes they relate to something else, and that's when we talk about existence or one, right? He says there are terms that designate what belongs to something in relation to something external to it, like just and generous. And I don't want to go through the full discussion he goes through. It's a bit laborious, but al-Farabi is recognizing that there is a problem with our language here, and he has to qualify our language in a way that tends to go beyond what we would normally mean when we talk about things being first, right? Okay, so now let's talk about the secondary causes of the active intellect, which are ranked in order of existence. We've mentioned them before. And by the way, I'm really following al-Farabi's text here, so as he sort of jumps around, you're sort of seeing he takes a multiple perspective approach and slowly articulates it. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here, I don't want to spend too much time on it, is that what we do see is that we see a type of symbolic thinking developing. We mentioned earlier his relationship to logic, and we're not really covering that so much in this video, but you can see by just this sentence, he says the relation of the excellence of the first to the excellence of a given secondary cause, X, is commensurate with the joy that X takes in intellecting the first in relation to the joy X takes in intellecting itself. So we see a way in which there's almost a development of algebraic notation here. Now, I'll have to be clear, this is from the translation. I haven't gone back. I can't read the original language, so I haven't looked there. But you can see that there's a high degree of analytic development that really goes beyond the type of discussion we see in Aristotle. So I think that you really can say there's a type of improvement on Aristotle's thinking here. Now, the celestial forms, this is secondary causes again, right? The celestial forms are in motion eternally without interruption, right? They just keep circling things on and on and on. So there is eternality there up until you get to the sublunar, as we mentioned before. Now, when we talk about happiness, right, al-Farabi talks about happiness here at 42. He says, the substance, nature, and activity of the celestial body is such that there immediately follows from it the existence of prime matter. So he thinks that the secondary causes are creating prime matter. Now, it then gives prime matter whichsoever of the forms that is in its nature, possibility, and predisposition to receive. And the active intellect is disposed in its nature and substance to examine everything that the celestial body prepares and gives, and whatever is receptive in one way to be freed and separated from matter, it frees from matter and privation, as a result of which that thing comes to be closest in rank to it. This means that the intelligibles that are potential become actual intelligibles, and as a result, that the active intellect that was a potential intellect becomes an actual intellect. Humans alone can become like that, and this is the ultimate happiness. That is the most excellent perfection that humans can reach. So what that means is that through a result of agency, and through a result of the active intellect and the celestial bodies, these secondary causes that are where prime matter is emanating and receiving its various forms, that this is ultimately where ultimate happiness comes from. And of course, the ultimate happiness is an intellectual happiness. It's not a physical happiness, because the physical stuff can never be happiness, right? Now, but it's all good because God created it. So anyway, now I'm just going to sort of end the video here. I've sort of talked and sort of given you a whole bunch of different angles, but I hope you're starting to get a sense of the basic matrix or system that al-Farabi lays out. And I want to end here by just sort of saying a word about his cosmology, right? He thinks that the celestial bodies exist for the first cause, right? That's the theory of emanation. And we already talked about, he has this heliocentric model. He has a geocentric model he takes from Aristotle, etc., right? But his whole model is based upon this cosmology. Now, one of the major problems is that it's a failed cosmology, right? Notice one of the things he says. He says the celestial bodies are numerous. They move variously in circular fashion around the earth. All are connected to the power of the first heaven, which is one. And consequently, they all move by virtue of the motion of the first heaven. So they have other powers by virtue of which they're distinct from one another, because of which their motions differ. Now, a necessary result of the power common to the whole celestial body is the existence of prime matter common to everything below the heaven, and a necessary result of the things by virtue of which the celestial bodies are distinct from one another is the existence of many different forms of prime matter. So now we see that in his cosmology, so each one of these spheres has prime matter, but they're different forms of prime matter. Now, and as a consequence of their different positions in relation to one another and to the earth, they are made to approach something sometimes and recede from it at others, to be in conjunction with one another. Now, I'm not going to say that. What's he talking about, right? The way I understand it, what he's talking about is when we go and we watch how Mars is orbiting, sometimes every 2 years, Mars gets closer to Earth. It comes closer, and then every 2 years, it recedes away from Earth. But it does it in a cyclical fashion. Now, we know today, the problem here is that the celestial bodies are not spheres. And also, they're not circular. They're actually in an elliptical path as a consequence of gravity, right? And so that's why they're coming and going away. But you can see here, why is this a failed cosmology? Because ultimately, because al-Farabi has the wrong model has the wrong cosmological model, he's ultimately now basically trying to articulate metaphysical reasons for the observations of our experience. And ultimately, this creates a big problem for us today. It's not a problem for al-Farabi, and it's actually quite brilliant. I hope you can see it's a mammoth undertaking, and he's actually done a very nice job. But you can see it raises for us some fundamental questions, which is namely, what is the relationship of reasoning in al-Farabi's philosophy? And also, what is the relationship of Aristotle's consequently as well? Can reasoning ultimately, we'll put it this way, can intellect alone get us to the truth of things? Where it looks like maybe we actually need to pay more attention to the physical, material side of things. So there's a sort of question in our modern interpretation of what the things we'd want to import from his philosophy into our own. The cosmological part is a problem. Now, it's a problem in Aristotle, so it's not a surprise. But I think that you can see here that he's got a very, very interesting analysis and theory of the universe and metaphysics, starting from the first mover, through theories of emanation, through secondary causes, ultimately to the soul, and to ultimately how we can attain happiness. And that's a little brief tour of al-Farabi's principles of existing things, and ultimately a general introduction to his philosophy. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. And again, I encourage you not to use this as use this lecture as a way to begin your studies of his philosophy, because there's a lot more there, and there's a lot of great works on this that really dive into this in much more detail than I can. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you guys all night.